Hi everybody, welcome back to Moral Psychology with me, Dr. Josh Redstone. So today's lecture is going to be a bit shorter than is typical. That's owing to some time constraints. Obviously I have to open up the final exam so that you can all get to that. And I know you're probably all busy with preparing for the exam. So I decided to keep today's lecture pretty brief. And I want to just kind of give you some stuff to think about that I don't know, you might find interesting and informative, and maybe fill in some of the gaps of that popped up in certain areas this semester. So anyway, there was actually a tie for what topic I'd be lecturing on today. It was a tie between empathy and morality and moral psychology and politics. And I am much more qualified to talk about empathy and morality. So I've decided to break the tie in favor of empathy and morality, and that's what we'll be talking about today. Now, I said I'd keep it short. Basically, I'm just going to try and schematize empathy by following the framework that's laid out by Heidi Maybaum in her paper, which I've already provided to you. But which I will, again, provide on See You Learn right below this lecture so that you can take a look at it. You don't have to read the whole paper, but you will want to focus in on the sections about cognitive empathy and affective empathy. And then I'm going to take a quick look at a paper by Jesse Prince that questions whether empathy is necessary for morality. Before we get started on that, though, I just wanted to make a recommendation to you all, and that is, of course, once again, this volume edited by Heidi Maybaum, all about empathy and morality. Lots of interesting chapters in here. So if this is a topic that you would like to read more about, I can certainly recommend this book. Of course, the book that Prince's paper appears in, that we're going to look at, which is Empathy, Philosophical and Psychological Perspectives from Oxford University Press. Also probably very good to check out. I have not read anything in that book beyond this paper, but it is on my reading list. In any case, there's lots of cool resources out there when it comes to empathy and what its role might be in moral cognition, moral development, and so on and so forth. Anyhow, I suppose I'll begin by going over a few of the bits from Maybaum's paper to sort of schematize the different varieties of empathy that are often talked about in the literature. So if you recall our very brief lecture on altruism, when we talked a little bit about the empathy and altruism hypothesis, you may recall that the authors of that chapter noted that there's no agreed upon systematized usage of terms like empathy or sympathy in the literature. And that's, I think, part of the reason why Maybaum has written this paper and others like it. For example, the first chapter of the book that I recommended to you is kind of like an expanded version of this paper. In any case, people use this term in different ways. I mean, obviously there's the way we use this word in our everyday parlance, which is kind of like, adopting someone's perspective or putting yourself in their shoes, as the adage goes. But empathy, or rather the varieties of empathic phenomena that we're going to talk about here are actually a lot more nuanced than that. So empathy actually comes from a German word, I believe, coined by Titchener, Einfühlung, which means to feel one's way into something. And it was originally applied, this term originally was used in fields like aesthetics. It was used, feeling one's way into a work of art or something, for example, right? But it's come to refer to the ways that we experience emotions that might be consonant, or if not exactly consonant, similarly valenced to other people, right? And more than that, as we'll see. In any case, excuse me, Maybaum writes in this paper that people often distinguish between two different categories of empathy. We have affective empathy on the one hand, or varieties of affective empathy, and then we have varieties of cognitive empathy on the other hand. So let's start with affective empathy and the different varieties of empathy that kind of fall under that umbrella. And then we'll move on and talk about the varieties of cognitive empathy. So as you can probably tell from the term itself, affective empathy is kind of more emotional or affective, concerned with affective states rather than cognitive states, like mental states, in other words. So as far as just straight up empathy goes, under this sort of affective empathy umbrella, it's not so much an emotion in itself as a way it is to come to experience emotions that might be consonant with another person's, right? And I won't get too far into the nuts and bolts of all of this, but you can read about it more in this paper. But basically, we can think of empathy as like an emotional resonance phenomenon rather than an emotion itself, right? If I empathize with you, for example, then what I feel is going to depend to some extent on what you're feeling, if indeed I'm empathizing with you. So basically, I can come to empathize with somebody if I perceive in some way that you are experiencing a certain emotion in a certain situation, or perhaps if I simply believe that you're experiencing a certain emotion in a certain situation, or if I imagine that you do. Of course, there are various ways to do this, right? Which again, I talk about in some of my previous videos, which I'll place links to those in my description. But yeah, there are multiple ways to come to empathize with somebody, and some of these include theorizing, some of these are more like simulating. Again, I'm not going to get into the details. I just want to kind of clarify the terminology here. So we have empathy. We also have a related phenomenon, which is sympathy, right? And sympathy tends to emphasize welfare and concern for another's welfare not really over the emotional component, but in addition to the emotional resonance component that we find in empathy, right? So I can empathize with you if I have a similarly valenced emotional state to you, and that's because I perceive that you're emoting such and such a way, or I believe you're in such and such an emotional state, or I imagine it, and so on and so forth. But sympathy's more closely tied to welfare. So if I'm feeling badly for someone or compassion for someone, like for example, Jen and the homeless man in our lecture on theories of moral motivation on the sentimentalist account, then I could be said to be feeling some kind of sympathetic response, right? And a couple of closely related emotional resonance phenomena to empathy, which are a bit less complex, would be emotional contagion and personal distress. So emotional contagion is very rudimentary. Think about like contagious yawning, right? You know, when someone yawns and all of a sudden you have to yawn. Or think of the way that dogs will bark reactively to another dog barking, or the way that infants will cry. That's called contagious crying in infants. When one infant cries, and all of a sudden the whole ward of babies is crying at the hospital, perhaps, right? Emotional contagion is kind of like that, where you kind of catch the emotions of another person. And personal distress is kind of like the opposite of sympathy, right? We encountered this a little bit. I don't know if you read too much of the chapter on altruism, and if you got into the discussion on the empathy and altruism hypothesis, you'll be aware that personal distress is kind of like self-focused, whereas sympathy is other-focused. So somebody could cry out in pain and I could feel badly for them, and that might motivate me to help them. But if I hear cries for pain and they cause distress in me that I feel for myself and not the other person, that may cause me to want to leave the situation because distress is unpleasant. That's personal distress. So it's kind of like the opposite of sympathy. All right, so those are a few of the different terms that kind of fall under this umbrella of affective empathy. What about cognitive empathy? let's talk about that briefly now, before we move on to Prince's paper. All right, so cognitive empathy is discussed in a couple of different ways. So this term is used differently depending on who you're reading, and admittedly, I've used it kind of differently in some of my own work in the past. So differently, between projects, I mean. So I am guilty of playing fast and loose with these terms sometimes, which again is one of the reasons why Maybaum is systematizing empathy in this way, right? Because researchers use different terms in different ways all the time. And this is one of the ways that philosophers can really help when it comes to, say, discussion about psychology or indeed any of the other cognitive sciences. Sometimes cognitive scientists or moral psychologists are talking about different things using the same terms, or talking about the same things using different terms. And, this is where philosophy can kind of help to inform our discussion or our terminology. In any case, cognitive empathy can be understood, or sometimes is understood as like theory of mind. So the ability to represent other people's mental states. So that is sometimes called theory of mind. Specifically, theory of mind is really about kind of like folk psychological theorizing about what others are thinking to explain their behaviors, for example, or something like that. But another way that cognitive empathy is also discussed is in terms of perspective taking. So this is the ability to sort of put yourself in another person's shoes. And this, I think, is another reason why it's good to really reflect on our terminology, because although cognitive empathy is sometimes talked about as if it is theory of mind, we can come to understand other people's minds not strictly by theorizing about them, folk psychologically, I mean. The idea that we come up with something like a theory to explain behavior, for example. Say I see somebody who's thrown their hamburger on the floor at a restaurant, for example. Why did they do that? Well, I might theorize about it. Well, people sometimes throw things when they become angry. So this person must have been angry about his burger. Why would he be angry about his burger? Well, perhaps it was a terrible burger. Maybe it was raw or something. So I could kind of theorize about why that person acted that way by positing beliefs and desires, and kind of coming up with this causal chain, this mental causal chain that explains why they've done what they've done, right? But I can also simulate, right? And I can do that by imagining what I would do in a similar situation, and I can kind of, adopt someone's perspective that way. Or I could imagine that I literally am the other person and do something very similar, right? So we don't just understand other people's mental states, nor even their emotional states for that matter, by theorizing. We can also do it by simulating. And I think theory of mind is best referred to that particular way of understanding other people's minds, whereas cognitive empathy refers to perspective taking more broadly. And that can be done by theorizing or by simulating, right? So, in any case, this is just, another reason why it's really good to talk about the way we're using our terms, to get everything clear, so that we know that people are using the same terms in the same way, right? And this is excuse me. And this is a big part of some of the work that Heidi Maybaum's done here, which has been very helpful for some of my research projects in the past as well. I think I may have mentioned before that she supervised my master's thesis, which dealt with empathy with human-like artifacts such as sociable robots. So I thought it was really cool to learn just how many different varieties of empathy there are, and not only that, but how we can talk about them precisely. So I think this paper is very helpful for that, and I hope that you find it helpful if you decide to take a look at Jesse Prince's paper, which we will discuss now. All right, so in Jesse Prince's paper, he kind of tackles this question about whether empathy is necessary for morality. Now, certainly sometimes some kind of empathy, like sympathy or compassion, might be important for morality. And we've seen in our previous lectures that, for example, on Batson's empathy and altruism hypothesis, empathy often motivates us to behave in pro-social ways or altruistic ways. And this can be found in Maybaum's paper that we just looked at too. I mean, it is titled The Many Faces of Empathy and its relation to pro-social action and aggression inhibition. So empathy does have a role to play there, but whether it is strictly necessary for morality or whether it is not sometimes a hindrance to morality, to moral judgment or moral development, is an open question. And it's one that I think Prince tackles pretty well in his paper. Now, it's been a while since I've read this one closely, but there are a couple of parts that I want to draw your attention to. So firstly, in section 2, this is where Prince asks whether empathy is necessary for moral judgment in general, and he is skeptical about this. He starts with a brief look at some of the stuff from the sentimentalist tradition, namely Hume, and in a rather brief discussion decides that there are some cases where clearly empathy might actually hinder our moral judgments, depending on the moral theoretic framework you're thinking in. So, for example, on page 4, Prince asks the reader to consider cases where we're faced with deontological considerations as opposed to consequentialist considerations. So, going back to these thought experiments that we've covered, like trolley problems and transplant cases, the transplant case is what is discussed here. In a case like that, you might feel more sympathy, for example, for the 5 patients who require immediate organ transplants. You might feel, or perhaps even if you feel the same amount of sympathy for each person, there's still 5 people, right? And only one healthy person sitting in the waiting room that you could dissect and take organs from and distribute those organs amongst the 5 people awaiting different transplants, right? So here you could certainly increase utility by killing the one person and harvesting his organs to save the 5. You would also feel more sympathy, more compassion for the 5 versus the 1. But, at least if you're a deontologist, it is impermissible to kill the one person to save the 5, right? So here your sympathy would seem to fly in the face of this deontological consideration, right? This deontological principle that is never okay to harm another person or to use them as a means to an end. This idea of this compassion that you might feel for the 5 people awaiting organ transplants, well, too bad. Then again, that's funny to think about in light of what we learned in the second chapter about how deontology and consequentialism align with modern empirical findings about whether these are underwritten by affective processes or cognitive processes. Let's see, what else? Well, just a couple other points that are made here. I mean, if you take other kinds of considerations, like if you were to use a kind of Rawlsian veil of ignorance approach. John Rawls, by the way, has this idea of the veil of ignorance. The idea is that you don't really know anything specific about the people that you might be helping or hindering, right? You try to be objective by remaining ignorant of other considerations beyond just moral agency and moral patiency, strictly speaking. I don't know if that's a good way to summarize but that's my attempt at summarizing the veil of ignorance. So you might decide, if you take this Rawlsian approach, to distribute resources to the needy regardless of anything else about them, but there's no empathy required to do this. Or another example that's discussed very briefly here is, when you yourself are a victim of moral wrongness, you don't empathize with yourself. This is kind of typical of Prince's papers, by the way. He's very punchy in terms of the points he makes. There are a few more cases going that kind of continue throughout this paragraph on page 4, but another interesting point that's probably more important here that he raises is when other emotions do the work that people think that empathy is there to do, right? I mean, there are certain moral emotions that work. Disgust, anger, guilt, shame. We've talked about those in our moral emotions chapter. Those emotions, those moral emotions can function as such without empathy, right? We don't necessarily need empathy for those emotions to do their job. Moreover, Prince kind of emphasizes the idea of sentiments here, which are, sentiments of disapprobation or approbation. Sentiments, by the way, Prince is kind of talking about in terms of dispositions to feel certain emotions. So we have emotions that will work as part of our moral psychological machinery, right? And empathy may not be necessary for those things. In any case, I think Prince's arguments in this section are pretty interesting. I think they're worth taking into consideration. And I find myself, mostly on board with what he says at most points throughout this paper, although I sometimes think it would be nice if he said a little bit more about some of the points he made. I mean, again, here's Prince being kind of punchy in his delivery. It'd be nice to go into a little bit more depth in certain spots, but I think he does definitely raise some interesting issues here when it comes to whether empathy is necessary for morality. Certainly, it seems like empathy can help. It can do some of the work in terms of our moral psychology, our moral development, our moral judgment, so on and so forth. But it's probably not the whole picture, and indeed, in all cases, it may not be necessary. So I put to you a challenge once again to try and come up with some examples of cases where empathy would perhaps hinder morality or would not be necessary for morality. I know I've already asked you guys to do this, and I know probably a lot of you will be too busy to do this since it's the end of the semester, but if you feel so inclined, do offer some food for thought in the comments section. Other than that, I don't have too much else to say. I guess we haven't really focused on the entire paper at all, but just a sort of very small slice of it. But I thought it would be a shame to just not say anything about to not say anything about this, to not have any special topics lecture at all. And usually when I do a special topics lecture, it's very open-ended and it's more like an opportunity for discussion, just to kind of do something that gets us out of the textbook, which has some interesting, albeit dense and dry chapters. So if you have the time, I'm happy to chit-chat about this further. I'm sure this lecture is much shorter. Let's not even call this isn't even a lecture, okay? This is just a kind of interesting food for thought video, all right? I'm sure you guys want to get to studying, get to preparing for the final, and you're not too concerned about this, and that's okay. I just felt like it would be a shame if I didn't do anything for lack of time or something like that. So I guess I'll wrap it up now. Just after I've had this brief like sit down. This is almost like what I would do in office hours, right? If someone came down and asked me, "What do you think about empathy and morality, Josh?" And then I'd say something like, "Well, I don't know. Here are some papers you can read by Maybaum and Prince and so on and so forth." Wow, thanks, Josh. That's really interesting. I'm going to read more about empathy and morality. And again, I suppose special topics lectures, the way I do them anyway, really lend themselves to in-person discussion. So, feel free to hop on Discord and let me know if you want to chat about this or talk to me in the comments section. Or if you were hoping for a different special topics lecture, then I could point you towards some really great resources, perhaps about something else that you might be interested in that's related in some way to moral psychology. All right? So, yeah, I guess this is a really long roundabout way of saying get in touch. We'll talk more when you don't have this, final exam preparation hanging over your heads. Okay? Okay. All right, so that about wraps it up. I know this has been kind of a pathetically short lecture, but no, I think it would probably be best if everybody got busy studying and got busy preparing for the final exam. And by the way, as I mentioned in the end of my last video, or one of my last videos, it's with the end of the term crunch. I tend to get a little foggy on certain things because I'm thinking about so much stuff right now. But I will be making appearances on Discord all throughout this week. So if you have a question, even if you're writing the exam and you have a question and you need some clarification on something, do let me know. Please do let me know. Discord is probably the fastest way to get a hold of me because I just check it on my phone. You can send me emails though as well, and of course you can always drop a comment below the video. Let me know what your question is. And I also want to say that this has been a really fun class to teach. This is the second time I've taught it. I've enjoyed it immensely, although I lament that I was not able to deliver it in person. It was a real struggle to get my lectures even to be an hour or longer. But when I deliver this class, I don't lecture on any more material from any given chapter, but we have so much opportunity for discussion that the classes would often go to just shy of 3 hours. And it's really unfortunate that with COVID-19 we weren't able to have in-person classes. But again, I can't say this enough. Do reach out to me if you need to talk and get some discussion going, especially as you're preparing for the exam. All right? But even though the COVID-19 situation means that all of this has not been ideal, I still had fun. I hope you did too. And I'll be around if you have any further questions. So I want to say to everybody, thank you so much for participating in this class. Good luck on the exam. Get in touch with me if you have questions. And I'll see you guys next time. All right. Bye for now.